Hello there, my name is Lord Theranis, and welcome back to the next step in our journey through the lore of the Elder Scrolls. In this episode, we're going to be looking at what's probably the single most important event in the history of the Orbis, as we get to experience it at least, the formation of Mundus, the mortal plane. We're also going to be looking at the Aedra inextricably linked with the creation of said plane, Lorkhan, known both as the Trickster and the Father of Mankind. So please, join me as we turn the page of the Mysterium Xarxes once more, and delve into the world of the Elder Scrolls. Mundus begins with two things, an Aedra and an idea. That Aedra is Lorkhan, or at least that's what we're going to call him. Despite their differing stories of being and creation, one thing almost every pantheon in Tamriel has in common is a version of Lorkhan. Lorkhan, Sep, Sheor, Shazar, Lorkhaj, they all ultimately refer to the single godly being who first conceives of the idea of Mundus. Up until now, the Aedra had been content living in the realm carved from the void by the hands of their fathers. Lorkhan, though, had very different ambitions. He had a vision of a new, great plane of life. But whilst the Aedra were powerful, any individual Aedra was merely a campfire when you compared them to the raging inferno that was their forebears. Creating something as grand, as vast as a sprawling plane of existence, that's not something Lorkhan could do on his own. He needed the aid of the other Aedra. So he asked them for help. All of them. Lorkhan appeals to every Aedra in the Orbis with his grand plan, asking them for their assistance in creating Mundus, a brand new creation, all their own. Now, exactly what Lorkhan's aims for Mundus were is deliberately unclear in the lore. Lorkhan's a highly controversial figure in the universe. He goes from heroic seed of mankind to despicable vicious villainy, all depending on who is telling the story. Supposedly, the idea behind Mundus was to allow the Aedra to obtain true immortality by creating a place where the spirits could self-reflect, and in doing so they could equal and perhaps even surpass Anu and Padme. However, there's been many different motives assigned to Lorkhan, and we cannot definitively say that any of them are correct or not. What we do know, though, is that whatever Lorkhan's argument for the creation of Mundus, it was certainly a persuasive one. Whilst by some accounts the Aedra that would later be the divine Kinnereth was the first to agree to Lorkhan's plan, it wasn't long before many different Aedra committed themselves to achieving Lorkhan's vision. An Aedra named Magnus in particular was the one designated as the architect of the project. He was responsible for every detail of Mundus's design, every element that made up Lorkhan's grand vision. And so, they went to work. However, whilst many, and possibly the majority, of Aedra were involved in Lorkhan's plan, many does not mean every. Several Padmaic Aedra rejected Lorkhan's vision. They were put off by the idea of someone else having control over their creation, making them obey a framework. These Daedra decided to take a different route to creation. They used their individual powers to create smaller planes of existence all their own. These would later come to be known as the Planes of Oblivion, of which we've experienced some in the games. This event is one of the major dividing lines between the Aedra. It's here where we define the split of Aedra and Daedra, depending on whether they are involved with Mundus or not. However, undeterred by their brethren's rejections, the Aedra still move forward on Magnus's design. They pour away large portions of their powers to fuel the great creation. Some even give parts of their being itself to the fledgling plane. They coalesce as planets in space, orbiting around the central focus of Mundus, Nirn. Nirn is a particularly special case when it comes to Mundus and the Elder Scrolls universe as a whole. It's easy to think that Nirn might just be another part of Magnus's grand design. After all, the Aedra are already incorporating themselves as planets of their own in Mundus. Surely multiple Aedra working in concert would have no trouble at all creating another. However, Nirn's not an invention of the Aedra. Depending on when you believe the Aedra were created, it might actually be older than them, around before the original spirits even came into existence. Nirn is a work of Anu himself. When Padme shattered Nir's 12 worlds, he didn't completely destroy them. Fragments of each of the worlds still existed, remnants of what had been scattered across the void. Before their final climactic conflict, Anu salvaged these fragments and combined them all into a single massive world, Nirn. Nirn incorporates elements from all its component worlds into one great whole, and sits at the centre of everything as the Aedra weave Mundus into being around it, until at last the mortal plane is complete and the spirits can enjoy the fruits of their labour. Or at least that's what they believed would happen. The reality, as it always tends to be, was far different. The construction of Mundus was dangerous, draining work. Many Aedra who put their powers into its creation were crippled, or even outright killed by their sacrifice, all in the name of what they thought was a route to immortality and true godhood. But Mundus was no such place. As the Aedra walked their new plane, it became clearer and clearer that what Lorkhan had promised them, and what had actually been created, were two vastly different things. Mundus was magical, volatile, and extremely dangerous. Its very existence threatened to destabilize the Orbis, bringing death and decay to the ageless realms as reality began to seep into the world of the Aedra. As the magnitude of these dangers become clear, the majority of the Aedra then choose to flee Mundus in fear of and anger at Lorkhan's creation, and chief among them is Magnus himself. Their flight is the event that creates the second division of Aedra, into Aedra and Magnus. As the misdirected architect of Mundus and his followers leave the plane, they punch holes in its fabric as they rip through the boundaries between Mundus and Aetherius, the outer immortal plane of life. Magnus, being the Aedra of great power, rips a hole far larger than the rest, leaving the great light of Aetherius to shine down upon Nirn. In time, the residents of Nirn would come to see these holes as the stars, and Magnus's exit wound would be seen as the sun. But for now, the shadows of their departed brethren cast their light down on those few Aedra unwilling or unable to leave Mundus, the true Aedra, rising up against Lorkhan as deadly, draining mortality congeals into being around them. And so, the Aedra do one of the few things left that they can do. They take control of reality. The Aedra build a great tower, an unassailable, real spike in the instability of Mundus. At this adamantine tower, they gather and make the best of what they have. From the primordial instability of Mundus, they set the physical realities of Nirn. They organize its temporal progression, codify its spiritual being, and they even attempt to direct the flow of magic as it flows from Aetherius into Mundus in great quantities through the holes left by the Magnus. Then, reality directed as they desire, they turn to the next, perhaps more important to them, question. What to do with a defeated, broken Lorkhan? Lorkhan had been risen against by the other Aedra. He had been fought. Lorkhan's creation of men had warred with the other Aedra's creation of elves and other races. And finally, supposedly Trinimac, a great champion of the Aedra, had struck Lorkhan down. So they had only one answer for such a traitorous crime in the eyes of the Aetada: death. And so Lorkhan is slain. But there is one part that cannot be destroyed. Lorkhan's divine spark, his heart, would survive all attempts at obliteration. So instead, it is cast from the tower, exiled into the mortal realms. Where it falls, a great volcano of red mountain rises, and Lorkhan's essence is left to roam his ruinous creation. And so, the Aedra then go their separate ways. Some give themselves entirely to Mundus, becoming the Elnathae. Their absorption into the substance of Nirn stabilizes Mundus. It transfigures the surface of Nirn, creating the geography which we explore in the games. Some attempt to leave Mundus. They belatedly join the Magnus and Aetherius. And then finally, those Aedra that gave themselves planetary bodies, they ascend to their created planes, watching over Mundus from afar as the Divines. And so, the Dawn Era draws to a close. Time begins to flow truly linearly, and history begins. It starts with the Merethic era of the Elves. But that is another tale for another time. I don't have as much commentary to give this time as I have previously, partly because the story is already fairly detailed and well defined. There's only the minutiae to pick at and speculate about, and partly because this is one of the few Dawn Era stories that actually has the majority of its details agreed upon by its sources. Whether the writers at Bethesda are looking from the perspective of the early elves, the Khajiit, the Yakudans, or the early Needs, men, the personas might change, but the tale is clear. One spirit tricks or convinces the others into creating the world of mortals, and they pay the price for it. The Elder Scrolls might just be a game, and it might be a bit silly to look into it in this level of detail, but The Elder Scrolls is also a game that delights in unclear backstories, and details which fans are left to fill in for themselves. It's relatively rare to have a story that's this early in the history of the Orbis, that is this defined, and I feel that speaks to the impact of this story, and what really makes it special, in my eyes at least. But that brings us to the end of today's episode. As always, if you've enjoyed this episode, I would very much appreciate you leaving a like on it, and also subscribing to the channel to keep up with future content. In the next episode, we'll be holding off on diving into the history of Tamriel just yet, because I want to look at those remaining godly beings who've helped define that history. Starting with the 8, or 9 if you're not a fan of the White Gold Concordat, Divines of Nirn. Thank you very much for listening. I'll see you next time.